you for that really great recording is in progress. And for the invite, it's really lovely to be speaking as part of the digital history seminar. What follows is going to be an exploration of both the kind of practical considerations of network analysis, but also an exploration of how these methods can illustrate the circulation of books and manuscripts within a community. And in this case, that community is going to be Syon Abbey, England's first and only Birgitine monastery. What I want to get across is that while network analysis is an incredibly powerful tool that can be a game changer for people working with large corpora of connected manuscripts or books or people, there are certain things that need to be taken into account when using it. And this is particularly when it comes to things like data and data management. I am especially concerned with the affordances of network analysis for people who, a bit like me, have come to it after they trained as literary or historical scholars or librarians, and while they're reasonably computer savvy and they can figure out a lot of the kind of digital tools on their own with proper kind of Googling and research, they're not coders or digital historians by trade, but they still want to use these methods to explore problems within their own fields. So I'm coming from the perspective of what I think of as kind of accessible network analysis for the capable non-expert. Someone who wants to use the tool properly, but they're working alone, they may be in a small team, and they're teaching themselves as they go. So I'm also going to be talking about what I see as the next major roadblock for book historical network analysis in this vein, and it's what I'm choosing to call the one mode, two mode problem. And I'll explain it more fully as the talk goes on. But it's one of the main ways that the maths of network analysis and the kinds of things that we as historians of book and manuscript circulation want to measure. So that is, at least in my case, the movement of books and texts between people. This doesn't always necessarily match up perfectly. I should caveat that I have not solved this problem yet, nor am I the only person working on it. But I do think that as a field, it's the next thing that we have to address together. And I hope that over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, this will give you all a chance to think about what needs to be done next. However, this is not to say that network analysis is the wrong tool for analyzing circulation. In fact, I've used it myself fairly successfully. So what I'm going to do is the following. First, going to explain my own work with network analysis and how I structured my networks and the things that led me to learn about Syon Abbey and the circulation of its books and manuscripts. And that was namely that the Syon sisters, who lived an enclosed life, were still active in circulating books and texts in 15th and 16th century England. And in particular, I'll discuss my work using Mark S. Granovetter, the social scientist's strength of weak ties paradigm, and how I applied it to my Syon data set. Then I'll complicate it a little bit by describing this one mode, two mode problem, and how can and can't networks answer the questions that we have about provenance and circulation. And then I will finish by showing you some of my explorations into solving this problem for research, using a subset of my Syon data, and I'll point to some future directions for research and development, and then we can have some questions. So this all began as part of my larger doctoral project that I finished in 2024. When I began it, at the dawn of time, I wanted to do two related things. And the first was to find out more about Syon and how it fit into the already established networks that I knew existed in 15th century England. And the second, which in some ways seemed more compelling to me at the time, was that I wanted to see if network analysis could be used as an effective tool for this kind of work. So I treated it as a little bit of a scientific experiment. If I used method network analysis on dataset Syon's books, what would happen? So I could have the next slide, please. Yes, that's right. So first things first, what is Syon Abbey if you are not already a member of this lovely cult, and why is it so important? So Syon Abbey was a Birgitine monastery founded in 1415 as part of King Henry V's great work, which sought to create a collection of religious houses west of London. It was England's first and only Birgitine house, and it was also the last monastic house founded in England before the dissolution of the monasteries. So despite its relative youth, it became the wealthiest non-Benedictine house in England by the time of its closure in 1539. After the dissolution, the brothers and sisters of Syon went into exile, and the monastery buildings in Isleworth were eventually dismantled, and the site is now home to Syon House, the neoclassical residence of the Dukes of Northumberland. So those of you who are at Kew today were just across the way. This is an artist's rendering of what Syon may have looked like, and archaeology has revealed that it was huge. It was maybe as large as the Chapel of King's College, Cambridge, so it would have dominated the landscape. The exiled brothers and sisters eventually returned to England after living on the continent in exile, and they came back in the mid-19th century, and they set up in Devon. And the last Syon nuns oversaw the closure of that Devon house in 2011, after nearly 600 years of the English Birgitine order. They were the last surviving medieval religious order in England. Next slide, please. Thank you. Birgitines were members of the Order of the Most Holy Savior and followed the Rule of Saint Savior, which was a text that had been divinely revealed to the order's founder, Saint Brigida of Sweden, in a vision that she had received from Christ. And one of the unique features of the rule was that while it required Birgitines to live this life of ascetic poverty, it also allowed them to have as many books as they wished. And that's the quote that I have up on the slide here, which is probably the most famous line in English Syon studies. And here I'm modernizing the Middle English. It says, though books, it's gone on for a bit about how they need to live a life of poverty. And it says, though books, they shall have as many as they will, in which is to learn or to study. And so that Syon had two libraries. They had one for the brothers and one for the sisters, who lived in the building together, but separated into these two different enclosures. The libraries contain not only the standard liturgical works that there were needed for the day-to-day running of services and individual devotions at Syon, but also the latest devotional works by authors like Richard Rolla or Walter Hilton, as well as works by the brothers written for the sisters, and indeed for other women readers. And if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Lots of the work done on Syon Abbey has focused on its books, in part because of the unique ways in which books and Birgitine spirituality intersected, and in part because there's a lot of extant source material related to Syon Abbey that exists still, which makes studying it in detail a lot more feasible than other places that don't have as much survival. So the Syon Brothers Library Catalog, which is what we have up on the slide here, survives. As does the Syon Martyrologe or the Book of Martyrs, which records donations to both libraries throughout the medieval lifetime of the Abbey. And if you went to Medieval Women, that was on display there. Other scholars like Mary Erler, Anne Hutchinson, David Bell, and through the work that I'm discussing today myself, have used extant inscriptions and other bits of codicological evidence to try to piece together the Sisters' Library, whose catalog doesn't survive. And we've been able to come up with 60 odd books that are definitely related to the sisters, both in print and in manuscript. The Abbey's professed was this wonderful network of ex-Oxford and Cambridge scholars, noblewomen, members of prominent gentry families, in addition to members of identifiable families in the home counties. And their patrons were wealthy and influential. Syon's donors included members of the royal family, London tradesmen and guild members, and in some cases, the families of the brothers and sisters themselves. There were also tutorial relationships between Syon brothers and lay women, or the relationship between Syon and the Carthusian monks just across the river at Sheen Charterhouse, which was another one of these buildings that was set up during the Great Work. And it yielded the circulation of books and texts inside and outside of the Abbey enclosure. And of course, the almost simultaneous emergence of the London print trade meant that not only were patrons able to more efficiently produce books for the Syon sisters that could then be sold on to an increasingly literate public, the text written by the Syon brothers could be printed, often at the impetus of the abbess. So once you begin to dive into it, it becomes very clear that the circulations of these texts and these books, and here I'm consciously using those two terms differently because both types of circulation were happening, was happening both within the small community of the Syon brothers and sisters, but they were also, so to speak, part of the wider bookish networks of pre-Reformation London. And although they were enclosed, they didn't shy away from the outside world, and rather their actions seemed to reveal this purposeful networking, which allowed them to share their books, their texts, and their textual community with others. And so to me, this seemed like an ideal community for experimentation with network analysis. So before I talk about my own application of network analysis to the Syon data, I'm just going to talk about network analysis a bit on its own. It may be extremely familiar to some of you in the seminar, or it may be brand new, but I just want us to all be on the same page. So if I could have the next slide, thanks. At its most basic level, network analysis is the mathematical analysis of networked relationships, which are represented by connected pairs of data. So in my case, books and owners, or books and authors, or texts and the books that they appear in, are similar kinds of pairs like that. The actors in each pair are called nodes, and the action that they do is called an edge. Now, most people are familiar with network analysis through the visualizations that it creates. Those little spoke and wheel diagrams, you can see some basic ones up on the slides. And as you can see, network visualizations take the form usually of two circles, so those are your nodes, connected by a line, which is your edge. These are projected by your network analysis program. So in other words, the shape that these visualizations take is determined by a layout algorithm that you ask a program to make them create. Additionally, depending on what parameters you select in this program, these nodes can be sized differently in these visualizations according to a statistical measure that we call centrality scores. So in other words, so in this example, a node that is connected to other nodes might appear larger and more prominent to a reader, and that's what you see there on the right. And so they can measure different kinds of influence within a network. A person who has the most connection has what we call high degree centrality, but the person who seems to be the bridge between different groupings of nodes is said to have high eigenvector centrality, and there's a list of these that most standard programs will let you do. However, graph theory and network analysis does not require visualization. Graphs can be represented mathematically through something called matrices, which you might dimly remember from your A-levels. In this way, nodes and edges of a diagram get flattened into pairs of ones and zeros. And therefore, that those statistics that I mentioned are calculated using a more complex version of that same matrix map. So when fields like mathematics, the sciences, or social sciences use network analysis, they're often not visualizing at all. What they're doing is they're simply computing statistics and analyzing them. We use the visualizations instead to start kind of explaining the results to others. This does make some kind of sense because often these fields are working with data sets that are much bigger than what we can come up with in the humanities. Big data sets are hundreds of thousands of data points, whereas my Syon data set is only a few hundred based on the affordances of the extant manuscript material. And so from a practical standpoint, if you start to think about a big network visualization with hundreds of thousands of data points, that's going to be really difficult to parse. So instead, you look at these ranked lists of these generated centrality statistics, and they can tell you a lot about a network without even looking at the visualization, which then gets used for the higher level storytelling. And so within the field of digital history, these bigger sets are often created using documents from over, say, a long span of time. So the next slide, please. Thank you. The Tudor Networks of Power project, for example, used data from the state papers spanning the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth. And so their data set has something more like 20,000 nodes and 124,000 edges. And you can hear a lot more about these at a later digital history seminar. It's a really cool project and well deserving the Dessoir Prize. You can see here that while their visualizations begin to show you the basic shape of the growth of government during the Tudor period, it's difficult to do analysis without those stats, right? And indeed, this particular visualization, if you go to the website, it doesn't let you zoom even as it lets you search. So in many ways, you're exploring the data set within the confines of what the visualization lets you do, rather than using that visualization as an analysis. So what about smaller networks like mine? Humanities research does tend to produce smaller data sets. And of course, analysis is still possible at the smaller scale. So in my project, where I applied network analysis to science books, then I wound up with this network. Thank you. Which consisted of about 550 nodes and 740 edges. And then I'll just need to click again. Yeah, what does this mean? I will break this down later. For my purposes, this was a neat little data set for me to be able to analyze, but the nature of the data meant that there were some challenges to overcome in analyzing it. So next slide. Thanks. Probably the most exciting outcome of my work was the material that I ended up writing about in an article that I published in Manuscript Studies, which was called Syon Abbey's Books and the Strength of Weak Ties. As a lens, I used a classic network analysis theory developed in the 1970s by Marcus Granovetter, which is called The Strength of Weak Ties. And actually, that article where he originally introduced it is supposedly the most widely cited article ever in the social sciences. And basically, it says that information flows better in networks through weaker connections than stronger ones. So he says, whatever is to be diffused, so information, can reach a larger number of people and traverse greater social distance when passed through weak ties rather than strong. If one tells a rumor to all his close friends, and then they do likewise, many will hear the rumor a second and a third time, since those linked by strong ties tend to share friends. And his original data set was blue-collar workers in the Boston area who were looking for jobs. And the idea was that you got better leads through your acquaintances than you did through your best friends, since you were all getting the same information. So in other words, networks are pathways for what is called diffusion. In my study, I considered the flow of physical books and manuscripts, or the circulation of these books, to be the result of diffusion within the Syon network. So therefore, applied to manuscript circulation, you can start to hypothesize that by identifying these so-called weak ties, you might also be able to find the people who are most influential within a network, because they're the ones providing the texts or circulating them most widely, even if their initial apparent relationship with Syon doesn't seem particularly close or like it would be fruitful. So as I set up the network, I decided to search for weak ties and did this using a centrality measure called betweenness centrality. Now, betweenness centrality doesn't actually identify weak ties. It measures how many times a figure is on the shortest path between two other entities, and therefore tends to identify what Granovetter calls bridging ties, or the actors that tend to connect communities. So if you think about a network with, big blobs here and big blobs here and big blobs there, bridging ties are the ones that hold the network together. So if you took them away, the rest of the network would break apart and float away. Other network analysts like Stephen Borgatti identify it as a useful metric for identifying nodes that can facilitate diffusion. So in the context of my data set, betweenness centrality identified what was likely to be a weak tie. And it was up to me with my historical knowledge of the data to determine whether or not it had actually produced something useful or not. My thought was that identifying significant weak ties in Syon's network within a data set populated by existing secondary scholarship would be predictive of larger trends, and then point to other weak ties that might be equally significant, but not as present in the existing scholarly literature. That was my hope. So therefore, in the case of Syon's books, what I found was that Syon's weak ties were the family members of individual Syon sisters who served as these bridges between Syon and other religious communities. So next slide, please. As I hoped, the network indicated new actors of interest. So this slide shows the betweenness centrality rankings for my network. And you can see that, well, obviously Syon itself, because it's the receiving library, has a very high score, as does the provenance Syon donor, Margaret Beaufort, who we already knew about. The third place is taken up by someone called Elizabeth Reed. Elizabeth Reed, we know about because her inscription appears in British Library Harley MS 2254. Which is a compilation of Walter Hilton's The Pricking of Love and the Epistle on Mixed Life, along with two other inscriptions from a second monastery, which was Dartford Priory, which was also a house of women, was also a royal foundation, and whose books are often identifiable by the inscriptions of their readers, just like Syon. So it's kind of a peer institution. However, the reason that Reed's score is so high is actually that she shares a name with a Syon sister who's also named Elizabeth Reed, who was the sister or a close family member of another Syon sister, Alice Reed, and they were both related to a lay benefactor, Sir Robert Reed, the Chief Justice of Common Pleas. And so I desperately want Elizabeth Reed of Dartford and Elizabeth Reed of Syon to be the same person. If she were, there are all sorts of questions that could be asked about whether she left Syon for Dartford or vice versa, whether she brought her books with her, how she, went from place to place. It's not chronologically impossible. All the Reeds in the Dartford nuns. Okay.
Small intervention.
Yes.
Sorry.
All right. All the Reeds and the other Dartford nuns named in the volume lived in the same period of the late 15th century. But unfortunately, there's no positive evidence to link the two, but there's no negative evidence either. So can I have the next slide when we figured out? Yeah. The nice thing about network analysis is that you can just manipulate your data set to say, what if they were two different people? So if we manipulate the data set and we create two Elizabeth Reeds, then as you can see, Elizabeth herself disappears from these rankings. Robert drops several places, but a new person kind of comes up to take their place, and that's Emma Winter, who's another Dartford sister. And so if we move the slide again, thanks. This is a little visualization of her social networks. She was known to have owned or read a copy of the Disca Catonis, now extant as Bodleian MS Rawlinson G59. And she was the sister or close family member of two Syon actors, Marjorie Winter, who was a sister at Saupwell Priory before she transferred to Syon, and her brother, Simon Winter, was a Syon brother. Now, Simon Winter's role in book circulation at Syon is really well known. He was the tutor of Margaret Holland, the Duchess of Clarence, who you can see there. Winter wrote Holland, and that's her on the left, a copy of the Life of Saint Jerome that exists in several extant copies, including one at Lambeth, where I'm based, which contains the following passage in the prologue, which is directly addressed to Holland. Next slide, please. And that not only it should note the mo clearly to your ghostly prophet, but also it should more abide and turn to edification of other that would read it, and do to copy it for yourself, and sith to let the other to read it and copy it whoso will. So basically, this is going to be good for you. When you're done, copy it and send it to your friends. And evidently she did. This text is found in numerous manuscripts, which are now scattered around the world, including the oldest, which is Cambridge COL N19, which has been split into several parts that are now across different libraries. Beinecke 317, which has connections not only with Syon Abbey, but Syon's close acquaintances at the Carthusian Charterhouse of Sheen. In our collections at Lambeth, the Jerome text with the Winter prologue can be found in MS 432 by itself, and then in another Lambeth manuscript, MS 72, which is a Golden Legend, it uses that Jerome text for its Life of Jerome. We do not yet have identifiable evidence that these books circulated along the Winter family line to other religious houses, but we do know that Marjorie Winter, the sister from Saupwell who moved to Syon, witnessed Margaret Holland's later investiture into the life fraternity at St. Albans. So Margaret Holland was known to the whole family. And from this you start to speculate, but in a more informed way, thanks to these networks, if Simon Winter, the brother, was trying to distribute text through his student, would he not also try to do so through the sisters that he was still in contact with? And many interesting questions are to be answered here, but most importantly for me, the network has identified what seems to be a potential relationship between Syon Abbey and Dartford Priory. And that's something that we don't really know very much about. So for the purposes of thinking about manuscript circulation, then, networks become a very powerful modeling tool. But given the structured nature that I mentioned of the maths behind the network analysis, it's very important that your data choices and your data modeling serve both the needs of the network, but also the needs of your own research questions. This kind of quantitative or computational quality of network analysis is really all important from the perspective of both the creator of the network, but also the analyst. The creator needs to know that their data has to fit this model, this prescribed structure of the nodes and the edges, while the analyst has to be aware that the graph is only representing pairs of nodes and edges and not some kind of objective truth about the research findings. So basically, you just have to be really aware of mediation. And I think there's a tendency when we have these digital tools to look at something as, oh, it's told me absolute truth. It hasn't. It's just told you things a different way. So practically, what this means is when you construct a network, you're going to start with pairs, which for most beginning network analysts or digital historians without a lot of coding knowledge, you then feed into a network analysis program. And so the programs then use the math, et cetera, et cetera. However, and this is the really important thing, if you want your network to be constructed properly and for all of this to work, the data needs to be constructed in ways that the program will accept. And for basic one-mode network analysis, which is what most beginners and most programs can do easily, what you need are consistent pairs, which means that each node is the same kind of thing. So this means that you need pairs that are book to book, or person to person, or text to text, not book to text or book to person. And so if you don't have the consistent pairs and try to get your Gephi or your Palladio or your NodeGoat or whatever program you're using to generate those centrality statistics, then it won't actually accurately calculate what you're asking for. So if we look at this next slide, here's some pairs. In terms of the Winter-Holland network, you can see that complex relationships that lead to lots of books and manuscripts can get difficult. A person-to-person pair, like Emma Winter and her brother Simon, are easy enough to put in a pair. However, if you pair Simon Winter's relationship with Margaret Holland in the same way, that just simple person-to-person pair cannot represent the complex relationship which resulted in the creation of multiple instances of manuscript and text transmissions explicitly, right? We know it's there. We know that that's what we're alighting, but if you're coming to this kind of fresh, you won't see that. And so this is what we call one mode network analysis or single mode network analysis, because the nodes that you're examining are all the same type of thing within the network. However, and perhaps you've started to see the problem, one mode isn't really enough. We as historians are generally interested in the combination of books and text circulated by people or text circulated in codices. You'll notice, for example, that my network of the winters that I showed a little while ago didn't actually mention the text in the codices in which those texts occurred, even though they're an important part of the research findings. So the natural impulse is to have a network where nodes can be manuscripts, but where nodes can also be the people circulating those manuscripts. And perhaps if we're feeling like a reading challenge, we want to represent all three aspects of circulation with a little bit of metadata tagging and some other data curation. And this kind of a complex network is what is known as a multi-mode network. Thank you. So reapplying that to the winters, you could start to see something like this. Simon Winter wrote the Life of St. Jerome for Margaret Holland. That's two types of nodes. You could also do it with manuscripts containing texts. So Lambeth 432 and Lambeth 72 share the same Life of St. Jerome text. You could go wild. You could have three modes. Emma Winter owned Rawlinson MSG 59, which contained the text of the Diskette Catonic. The problem is, when you add on extra modes to your network, you're also adding more math for your network analysis program to perform. And in fact, every extra modality that you add on to the network adds exponential amounts of calculation for that program to do. And this requires, at best, extra power from your computer, and at worst, it will cause the whole program to crash and then lose your data. Ask me how I know. This is one of the major reasons that I made a one-mode network in the end for my doctoral project. On top of this, a multi-mode network needs to have consistent pairs of node and edge types. So in terms of my data, I would have needed to know every person-book-person relationship, when in some cases, just because of what we know about data and what's extant and what isn't, you only have people-people relationships or book-book relationships. In other words, the Winter network would be incomplete because I can't, for example, model both that relationship between Simon Winter, Margaret Holland, and the Life of St. Jerome, but also the sibling relationships, because there's no known text attached to that familial relationship. So it starts to have holes and the whole thing falls apart. So, next slide. As I see it, there's a bind for a person who, like most researchers I know, has complex questions, but isn't a trained computer scientist or coder. We have multi-mode questions, but we are limited by knowledge or circumstance to one-mode networking. And this is what I think is the one-mode, two-mode problem. This is not to say that there aren't workarounds and solutions for this problem, many of which have been put forward by social scientists, for whom network analysis has been a long-standing method and theoretical framework. Thank you. Yes. One obvious solution for the problem of exponential calculation requiring a more powerful machine is just to get one, either on your own or through the IT department of your institution or the library. However, that isn't necessarily feasible for everyone, for financial reasons, for institutional reasons, people who are independent scholars, that kind of a thing. Next slide. Another solution is to work around that problem and simply create the best one-mode network to answer your research question. And so that's what I did with my Syon network, where my node pairs were two people or a person in an institution. And then the edge represented the gift of a book or the gift of money or a familial relationship. So the node pair that said Simon Winter, Margaret Holland encapsulated that whole relationship. And because it was just me doing the work, I knew that for myself, and that was fine. This worked reasonably well in that I could answer my research questions and I came up with some new directions, but as we've seen, it limited the complexity and nuance of the network because it didn't allow me to represent full circulations. So the next solution is to bypass common humanities network analysis programs, Gephi or NoGoat or Palladio, and create networks using code bases like R or Python. This certainly allows extra flexibility with the network, but for the individual researcher whose tech strategy is follow the instructions in the tutorial and then experiment using solutions to common problems found on Stack Overflow, this too seems difficult without the built-in time to learn and essentially to practice code. And depending on where you are in your career or at your institution, you may not have that dedicated built-in time. Another more library and information science focused option involves just changing your database structure entirely. Rather than relying on traditional relational databases or pairs to hold your data, you move on to something entirely different, which is called a resource description framework triple, or an RDF triple, which is what the basis of linked open data is. In other words, you change your data into semantic data and model it that way. And while that's not true network analysis, that's still representing your data in a linked and networked way. What I sometimes joke is if your network analysis does not have your nodes and edges, then all you have is sparkling data visualization. This is your sparkling data visualization. And these can then be formed into graph databases and visualizing graphs that look an awful lot like networks. There's a program that does this called Neo4j, which requires its own kind of code formatted input language. The challenge here is that, as I say, they're not classical networks. I think this is the avenue that requires further investigation, as library catalogs tend to move closer to a linked open data model, so you could probably ingest your data in that format that you need. But again, it requires time and training that those of us in collection-focused roles, sometimes don't have. So these are, I think, the two most promising options for what I'm going to explain will be what I think the two most promising options for creating complex networks are at this stage. Even though they don't fully create a multimodal network, they can still measure multimodal pairs and create some kind of data analysis that can aid in producing some more fulsome results of the research. So for this, if we go to the next slide, we're going to use a different network, a visualization of which is up on the slide here. This network, and it's just blown up huge so you can see the shape of it, is of all of the extant Syon manuscripts and the texts that they contain. So the manuscripts are connected by texts. And it's a precursor to maybe looking at how these texts circulated around from manuscript to manuscript. It is a two-mode network in that the first node type are the codices and the second node type are the texts. On this visualization, I've done some basic community clustering, so that's the different colors that indicate what the network thinks are different communities of nodes, and some degree centrality sizing, so things that have more connections are bigger, to start to make the visualization that you're seeing now a little bit easier. But there are a few different ways that I was still able to work with this data, even though I only had the capability to analyze this as a one-mode network. So next slide. The first option is what I'm going to call, slightly euphemistically, knowingly cheating. Its formal name is compound network visualization or compound network analysis. And so a true multimodal network will take into account the different node types in the underlying matrix structure and will visualize it accordingly. And that's what's computationally difficult for these programs to do because of the exponential nature of the data. But what would happen if you just created all the pairs you wanted, regardless of the maths, threw it into Gephi and saw what happened? And that's what I've done here. Essentially, Gephi is reading my two-mode data like it is one-mode data and visualizing and calculating accordingly. It's not correct, but what it does do is it shows you something. And I think sometimes when you have these big data sets, the important thing here is to just put yourself on a different research path than you would have ordinarily gone on. So the statistics do indicate still some areas of significance, even if they're not mathematically perfect. And that's how I've managed to group the network into communities of genre using that community clustering tool. So we're looking right now at a community of liturgical manuscripts, and it's done a pretty good job at figuring out which ones are liturgical. And once the network has identified these basic starting points, you then get to investigate the things the network shows up. As you can go down some roads, you can completely ignore others. It's not a bad workaround. However, as you can see, what happens is you get this much more cluttered visualization. And you can also see that it's sometimes placing undue attention on nodes that just really aren't as significant. This is the liturgical section of the network, and you see that the biggest nodes you have are Psalter and Litany, and that's not really all that surprising. That's just that they're common liturgical texts. And so it's not really relevant to my initial starting question of what is the text circulation of these manuscripts. Nevertheless, it is still showing me more data and connection points than it would have if I had just had one type of node. And then if we can move to another section of the network, and this is a grouping of composite manuscripts, so things that have lots of different texts in them, you can see that individual manuscripts with more texts than others are given more prominence. And that's not all that helpful either. We know that this one has 15 texts and this other one has 2. That's not answering our research question. So another thing that you can do if you are bound and determined to get this two-mode thing to work is you can flatten your data. Flattening data requires the research to create that bimodal or multimodal graph and then ask the computer to flatten it back into a single. So ideally, if I were to flatten this network, it should just collapse in and show me a statistically accurate one mode graph again. Ta-da! There it is. So this requires some knowledge of getting plugins and an ability to be patient while the program inevitably doesn't do what you want it to do. But the reward in this case is this network that has removed the manuscript. So you're back to just texts being connected to other texts. So what we started with, we knew that there were manuscripts that had X, Y, and Z texts. Now we know which texts seem to be more connected to each other. Back to basic building blocks, the nodes are now the text and the edges are the flattened connection that used to be the manuscripts that they shared. So this starts to be a little bit clearer and provide a bit more research direction. So if we highlight, yes, the revelations of Birgitta of Sweden, for example, show up as a bridge between a few different genres of text. The green at the bottom are sermons. And the reasons that they're so snarled down there is that there's just a lot of them. We recognize the liturgical books to the right. But we see here is that Birgitta's revelations, and more importantly, the papal documents about her canonization, which seem to co-appear with the sermons, with the liturgical texts, and with the texts related to the revelations themselves. And so there, that flattened network is showing research direction for a question about the circulation of Brigittine texts and papal documents within the late medieval English manuscript million. So you can start to get there. So the problems and potential solutions I've outlined are not perfect. If I somehow met a benevolent DH magician who could create the perfect thing, I would want something that merges that linked open data structure, data visualization, and really well-structured network analysis and statistical measures, all with a so easy it's laughable interface. I have tried to learn Python 6 or 7 times and I just, it's not going in. Next slide, please. This is in fact the last slide. The thing is that the best resource is the networks we make ourselves. Last year, I went to a 2-day workshop. It was online on medieval women in network analysis. It was hosted by Kathy Krause and Laura Mariali. So right in the middle of what I researched, and 200 people registered. I haven't been in a Zoom meeting that big since 2020. I found out about projects I didn't know existed. I found out, most importantly, that there are tons of other people working on these same kinds of problems at the same time. So Kalani Craig at Indiana University Bloomington has been developing something called NetCreate, which blends network analysis and historical close reading so that you can kind of create your networks as you're actually reading a secondary source. In a way that makes data entry work a bit better for humanists than the way that we tend to process the information that we're reading. And she's used it to great effect in her classes, for example. When I was based at a university, colleagues from other departments, the library, instructional technology services, colleagues from hard sciences or medicine or that kind of a thing, people who look at problems differently and have different knowledge bases were invaluable. You all come together and you look at things a little bit from a different perspective and suddenly it's changed, just like what network analysis tries to do. And of course, the thing that is so often true in our field, you can just kind of cold email people whose work you admire. I have found that actually to be the most helpful thing of all. All of our colleagues have been so generous with their time and their information. And some of the things that I have learned from them have genuinely propelled my work forward in unpredictable but vital ways. We are often pushed by the affordances of our institutions and the ways that our jobs work to be doing this alone, but we really don't have to, and we shouldn't. We have to exist within this networked community ourselves. So I look forward to learning things from all of you during the question period and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So before I hand over to questions, and for those online, if you have questions, either please put them in the chat and I'll read them out, or raise your hand and I'll work out a way of unmuting you. I just want to say that your line, it isn't correct, but what it does is show you something. I think both embodies the ethos of the seminar and is the sort of thing we could use with our new strap lines. Question. Please.
This is fantastic. I have many thoughts and reactions. I wanted to ask first just a quick clarifying question.
Yeah.
You mentioned these possibly 1, possibly 2 Elizabeth Reeds.
Yeah.
Can you give me the dates again?
So they are late 15th century. I cannot remember their exact dates, but the person who will know is Virginia Bainbridge, and if you
Okay.
send her an email and ask, she will send you their little mini biographies.
Excellent,
Yeah,
I will follow up with her. It might just be interesting for you to know that Reed is traditionally a goldsmith's name. And there is, I've been trying to pull it up on my phone and I can't get my documents to load correctly. There's a later Elizabeth Reed who is a goldsmith's widow, who's very involved.
And
in
she's
kind
the
of
one who has
patronage.
the tombstone at the Charter House, is that her? Yeah.
Yeah, her
Yeah.
husband,
Yeah.
yeah, and very involved in the kind of patronage networks, and she's a big bequeather of books, although not necessarily directed to religious houses.
Yeah,
No,
I looked at her, I got very excited, I decided it couldn't be her.
yeah, I
Robert
think it's a
Reed
bit
is
too late.
interesting as well. He, there's a line that I'm probably going to die still remembering from Julian Luxford, where he calls him somebody who has a rich and tentacular spiritual profile.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
That's
it's
fantastic.
fabulous, but he has his fingers in many different kind of pots. He seems to be active with the Charter House, he's active within the city, he's active within his guild, and then he's related to these Syon sisters, and I feel like what we are missing in the Syon networks is somebody pulling in all of this city information
Yeah,
and seeing what it does.
yeah.
Yeah.
The other question that I have, it's something I've been wondering about in my own work for the past, couple of months really, is sort of the specific physical and logistical mechanics of book exchange.
Yeah.
Like the physical moment in time at which the book changes hands, especially when it's coming from the secular lay society into the enclosed, community. Are they just sticking it through the grate? Are they,
Yeah.
you know, like obviously there's probably more than one answer, and obviously it's also probably somewhat an impossible question, but I'm wondering, you know, what you might have to say about that.
I'm happy to speculate. We don't know is the
Yeah.
answer. We don't
Yeah.
have any, again, with so much, and I think it's very related to, it's not perfect, but it tells us something. There's just so much that we are never gonna have positive evidence
Yeah.
for, and so I think we do really need to lean in more to informed, cautious speculation
Yes.
in this area. But with that, I think you have a couple of choices. I think, you know, there are a huge number of people who go to the pardon sermons. So Syon, for those of you who don't know, hosts these huge pardon sermons where you can show up, listen to a sermon given by the brothers, receive an indulgence for having been there, and then you leave. And it was, in fact, so crowded that they actually had to introduce snaking queues for people to come through and get their
Wow.
indulgences. Marjorie Kemp shows up, she cries.
Actually.
Yeah, but it's a place to see and be seen as well, and I think that there there's certainly space for there to be a mechanism for you to donate to the Abbey. And at that point, if you wanted to donate money or books, you could. I think there are also, you certainly can still write to them at the Abbey. You can say, "Dear Mother Abbess, I would like to donate to the Abbey if you will say prayers for my soul. I have a
Yes.
book, here you go," and that's what gets written into the Marloge. I think also, you do have with, the brothers and the sisters and that kind of internal exchange, there probably was a certain amount of books going through the grate. But they do also have people like Thomas Betson, the librarian, who's doing the repairs to the books, and I think probably there are intermediaries who could say, take a book or a collection of books and move them across. Certainly when you have people like the London printers, when they print in bulk for the Syon sisters, there's a point where they're printing like 60 copies of something for them. And that's gonna all have to come in at once, almost like a delivery.
Yeah.
And it's kind of charming to think about them delivering books like they might deliver fruit and vegetables. But I think there's a lot of different ways for it to go in from the city, and I think we often assume that enclosure means non-communicativeness, and I mean, Syon just proves this
No, it's
simply
so
not
porous.
true. They
It's
have
so
so
porous.
much land, they have so many representatives, feeding their interests. I don't see how the books can come in that way as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions in the room, I'll move to a question online from one of our conveners, Alexandra, who, out of, I think, interesting curiosity, or anything else, asks if there are other sources that you think you could start to integrate into a data set like this, and whether you anticipate that would sort of make any fundamental changes to the outcomes of the kind of work you've been doing, irrespective, I guess, of the data, as it were.
Yeah, hi Alexandra, it's nice to see you online. So this particular data set, what I would like to do is somehow scoop up all the brothers' data. My data set, for the limitations of my sanity and the length of my PhD funding period, I limited to the sisters. But the brothers, I mentioned, they have this extant catalog. And it's like 900 books strong.
Wow.
And it has not yet been turned into any kind of a digital database, but it exists in this fabulous, like, edited edition. If I could somehow just ingest all of that in bulk and get that into the network, I think that would start to show us some really interesting things, especially around the family and the kinship networks. The problem is I don't know when I'm ever going to have enough time again to sit down with 900 books of a CBLC volume and then just input the data one by one. That's the challenge. So the other thing that I've been thinking about, and that was actually the first title for this paper way back when, was that now in my role at Lambeth, I work with a lot of provenance data. And so completely coincidentally, I'm now also involved with the recataloging of the material related to Syon College, which has nothing to do with Syon Abbey, they just share a name. But Syon College, like Syon Abbey, has this book of donations. It's called the Book of Benefactors. And so again, you have this list of people, it's 17th century, and it's people from the City of London who are donating books to this library. But it's the same kind of thing where you really want to know about both the relationships between the people, the relationships between the books, and then the relationships between the books and the people. And so we've digitized it at Lambeth, we've OCR'd it, we have all of this raw data, and I just am having a very hard time kind of thinking about how that might then get ingested into a network program. And that's where I think the linked open data might have some promise. And, there are other kind of similar situations like that. And I think that if we could come up, everybody who's working on, well, essentially benefactors book or donors books or martyloges or that kind of a thing, if we could all agree on one program and one structure to use, we could then start ingesting lots of different sets and playing around with them. And so I think there's some value in that as well.
And despite seemingly being time poor,
Yeah.
you did answer that question with great enthusiasm, which kind of led me to something that I was thinking at one point, that there was almost a sense of regret that you tried to model these kind of complex historical phenomena as data at all. And I guess you don't necessarily regret that process and that set of choices, because it seems like it's revealed things which have enabled you to, if not challenge the existing historiography, but at least find things you didn't expect to find.
I think, well, okay, so when I proposed my PhD topic, I did my PhD in Norway. They do things a little bit differently there in that I kind of applied for it like it was a job, like a faculty position. They said, does anyone want to do, Syon Abbey and network analysis? And I was a special collections librarian there, but also working on a big digital research project. And I thought, oh yeah, that sounds kind of fun. I do 15th century stuff. I do books. I do digital stuff. Let's put it all together and see what happens. And one of the people I talked to, and I said, should I do this? Said, oh, well, Syon Abbey is done. And I think, it's a flippant statement and it was said, not entirely seriously, but I think what the gist of it was, lots of people have talked about Syon Abbey. And I think there is incredible value when you have such a rich amount of secondary scholarship where you could start to flippantly say things like Syon Abbey is done, by forcing your brain to look at the same information differently. Even if you were not interested, if I didn't find a single new thing in my primary source research, fine. What this data cleaning and curation and forcing into this, network model or that network model is doing is just making me look at something as though I'd never seen it before. And I think that is really valuable in and of itself as a form of research, because otherwise we just get stuck into reading the same things and thinking the same things. And so in terms of enthusiasm in the time comment, I would love to have an extra 30 hours and the energy behind them to get these kinds of things done. And I think, everyone I know in these fields has 6 different projects that they'd love to turn to. And so if there is a way to harness all of our networks together to actually get one of these things done, the other kind of underlying message of this paper, I think, is it's really hard to do things on your own. You have to do them with other people. Otherwise you will run into a roadblock and you'll just stop. So hopefully that answers your question.
Please.
Building on what you just said about sort of looking at things differently, that throwing up new information, do you have a theory about the connection with Dartford? If there does turn out to be one?
Well, the thing that I just keep thinking about Dartford is it's kind of a foil to Syon, right? You know, they were also founded late.
Mhm.
They also had a men's house that they were associated with for a long time, King's Lynn. They also have what appears to be a conscious book sharing program, and the other that I would put in this triad is Barking.
Mhm.
So Barking Abbey is, if Dartford is the very similar foil, Barking is the very different foil. Whereas Syon and Dartford are new, Barking is old. Founded 666, right? But they also are well known for their literary exchange, and they have the specific. If you read the Barking Ordinal, which if you love administrative documentation, she said with a beatific smile on her face, you can see that they actually had like a library loan system where you gave a sister a book every year and it was her book to read for the year, and then she exchanged it back. And that's how you start to see an actual program of almost assigned reading as opposed to individual discovery and devotional practice. And while I think it's possible that all of these things could be popping up in the 15th century independently, you know, we do all seem to be coming to similar research conclusions and questions independently, you know, now within our field, for example. I think it must be more likely that they somehow have to be in communication with each other. And if you think about things like, so there's a letter from Thomas Betts in the Librarian, where it's actually, and it's in a Durham manuscript, and it says, well, beloved sisters in Christ, we're sending you books, copy them and move them on. And so I wish I knew who he was sending that to. Is it other Birgitine sisters on the continent? Maybe. Is it other sisters in England? Also, maybe. You know, it's written in English, not in Latin. So I need like one more piece of evidence to start to go forward with that, but that's the thought direction I'm heading in with it.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If I may, so I'm so glad that was asked about that question.
yeah.
So I was quite curious about it as well. But now I have to ask about like my own personal interest.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is what, if any, interaction with the other mendicants have you seen amongst the Syon brothers and sisters?
Oh, see, that's the thing is I can't say that I have seen
That's so
very much.
interesting.
There's a little bit of it's a weird little interaction with the Franciscan friary that I started to pull at a couple months ago with a manuscript that's at Oxford now, Bodley 62, where it somehow winds up with the observant friars in Exeter before the dissolution. Why? We just don't know. It's a book of hours. Why would they be doing that?
Yeah. And why Exeter when Richmond's so much closer?
I don't know. I wish I did. This is the problem with these, is that like I feel like we have, if we were to see the network of the actual reality, we have so many black holes in our vision, and we can project what we think might be there, but
Yeah.
That's the flip side. If I just want to find one more piece of evidence, it could throw everything off. Right?
Yeah.
You have a map of ins and outs, presumably more's coming in than out.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
What would it look like? What's the ratio?
80-20.
Oh, okay.
70-30, something like that. You know, I think the thing that's actually skewing the outs for me is print.
Yeah.
Because the thing that I haven't really talked about much today is the way that diffusion also happens through patronage of these printed works. And so what you do wind up with is, you know, Richard Whitford writes The Pipe of Perfection, and the abbess then sends it off to Wynkyn de Worde for it to be printed. And then all of a sudden, bam, there are 300 of them out now. And that, I think, really magnifies the reach of what they're able to do in terms of sending books to people. It's no longer targeted. It's obviously, you know, they're able to get what they want out of it, which is their class sets of books. But they are inadvertently or purposefully, and I do think it is a bit more purposefully, sending their teachings out into the city, into this group of, you know, gentry women a lot of the time who are able to read these texts. And so once print happens, if you're going to include that in that ratio, then I think it gets smaller and it's more 60-40, right? But they're also receiving these books of volume. So it becomes again, about what you choose to measure and how you choose to explain it, to answer that kind of question. There's so much about, digital history. When you ingest all of this data, I think there is, as I mentioned earlier, a bit of a tendency for those of us who are new to it to say, oh my goodness, this is so wonderful, it's doing all these calculations for me. But we have to be just as picky about the tools and the way that we're putting information into these tools as we are with interrogating our own primary and secondary sources and how they're created and how the information gets into them, because it's media literacy and it's info literacy, it's just on a different level.
Is there sort of, in the post-Reformation period, is there a continuation of these books sort of looking at the provenance being in the hands of women, or because it's sort of controversial materials it's sort of end up locked up and
I'm
that's
so
it?
glad you asked that. In May, I'm going to talk to the Antiquarian Booksellers Association seminar about Syon's later books. Not really, but also sort of. I mean, this has been my answer to every question, but so when the Reformation happens, some of the sisters go to the continent in exile. Some of them stay in England in what I kind of think of as little retirement communities. They go and they stay with somebody's brother or somebody's male relative. They live quietly, not quite underground like recusant priests, but they certainly are still there and together, and I can't see them not continuing to, worship in the same way. And the last abbess does that. She winds up dying, and her funeral brass is in Denham. And so those books, they take some books with them there. They take some books to the continent. And some of the books stay with them as kind of, I don't want to say talismans, they're still working documents. That Marloge goes with them all the way to Portugal, where they live for quite a long time. But then when they come back to England, they run out of money. They're invited back, but they just have they need to set up a new house. They need to suddenly exist within this new governmental system. And so they start selling off the books into the antiquarian book trade. And from there, they start going to collectors. And that's how a lot of them have wound up in library collections. So I think there's an effort in the immediate post-Reformation period to try and keep the books together. But I think at a certain point, what they're really interested in is surviving as an order.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Seeing as you've started to trend into telling stories of time, I'll ask the classic sort of network analysis problem question, which is just, where, given that these collections quite well, and given that the data itself is flattened in various different ways, how, as you're interpreting this, are you thinking about temporality in relation to network graphs and network data that ultimately is always atemporal because it's rubbish at doing temporality? How are you kind of working through that process?
I mean, the rubbish answer is I just decided to ignore it a little bit. A lot of my strategy was to use the network not as an end, but a means to an end. And so if the network threw up something, then I would look at it and go, well, this is nonsense because it doesn't make sense within the temporal, these three connections are from three completely different periods of time and it doesn't make any sense. And this isn't a trend, even if the computer thinks it is. I think also the extant data with the Syon collections kind of does it for us in that we have a lot more information from the later period of the 15th century and into the early 16th than we do from that early chunk. So Syon's founded 1415. They try and build first in Twickenham and in Teddington, and they decide it's too damp. So they move to Isleworth, which is a weird choice, but they've done that. And so that early period that they're working with, they're not as concerned about building the library so much as rebuilding a building, getting new people to come and join the order, and then holding onto their money. The Wars of the Roses start, and the money that's promised to them by the Lancastrians, essentially they have to immediately make sure that that same privilege is maintained by the Yorks. Then the Yorks are out and the money gets taken away again. Henry VI wants to use it to build Eden. And so they're in constant legal battles. And so I think they're really only settled by the 80s, 90s. And so in that way, even though technically my data spread is 1415 to 1539, there's just this big hole in the beginning bit anyway. And so you wind up with something that's artificially compressed chronologically anyway. That obviously won't work for every data set.
No, but it sounds like it intellectually at least makes sense.
Yes.
That's what the thing you
Yeah,
started.
yeah,
This
yeah.
seemed ideal for this kind of work.
Yeah, it kind of all came together, at the last minute, but it did.
Sorry, this is just a continuation
Yeah,
of my
go
previous
on.
question. Are there any books from the time under Queen Mary when they go back for about 5 seconds and then leave again?
The poor things, they must have turned up so hopeful and then they had to leave again. They bring some back. So one of the Lambeth ones that we have, 3600, NS 3600, is one that they bring back, and try and reintegrate into the new Marian Syon Abbey. And then when they have to leave again, when Elizabeth comes to the throne, they leave it behind.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so there are little bits like that, but I don't think they're, back in their normal book producing program that they had. The book landscape is also radically different between the 1530s and the 1550s. And I do wonder, although I don't know very much about it, what they would have thought of that as they came back into it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? We have no other questions online. Which might mean that our rapid tour of 15% bibliographic reading networks
Yes,
has come to an end.
but it can live on in your hearts.
So I'm gonna stop sharing so we get an opportunity to
Lovely.
see our audience if they want to show themselves, but if not, thank you so much, Julia, for a really wonderful seminar.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
One of the delights, I think, of the digital history seminar is that we end up with a variety of different topics every course of the year, and I learn a huge amount, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just before we close off proceedings for the evening, I just want to let everyone know here in the room and online that our next seminar is our postgrad panel, which we have every year with two very different topics. One looking at assessing the capabilities of named entity recognition for historical documents, another on the plant collections of Hans Sloane. That'll be on the 25th of March. And for those more interested in the kind of we also occasionally stumble across accidental themes, which we seem to have this spring. So those interested in medieval Tudor England, we have Rachel Haslam on the 28th of April from York talking about network and linguistic analysis of late medieval church court disputes. And as you mentioned earlier, Julia, we have the Arnott's on the 22nd of May, which I believe is a lunchtime seminar talking about their book, The Tudor Networks of Power, which was the recipient of the 2024 Richard de Swart Prize in Digital History. So hope to see some of you at one of those future events. But once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, online people.
Thanks, online people.